Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle and welcome to the National Parks Expedition Challenge. So today we are here at Fort Monroe National Monument in Hampton, Virginia. We're going to be talking to two rangers, but we're going to start first with Ranger Brittany. So Ranger Brittany, first of all, thank you for calling us and allowing us to come here today. How did you get to the national parks?
So I started in a really unique way. My background is actually in the humanities and what you guys would call maybe language arts and social studies. And I loved museums. So growing up, I always wanted to be a writer. I went to school for English, and then I just decided I wanted to be in museums all the time. Eventually I started working at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in Washington, D.C., his big old house from the late 1800s. I was a ranger. I still am a ranger. Was more often in uniform, like our ranger friend here, Ranger Aaron. And at that time, I realized I wanted to connect with students more. So I went on to get my job at the National Park Service Chesapeake office, which is what I do now. I'm an education coordinator, and I help partners and friends all across the Chesapeake Bay Watershed connect with folks on the ground to teach about the very important history and culture and natural resources of our watershed. And that's from New York down to Virginia, right here at Fort Monroe.
That is a lot of places that you have to cover, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but let's go over to the guy in the uniform here, Ranger Aaron. So Ranger Aaron, do you have the same kind of story? How did you get here?
I would say certainly similar, and it's not uncommon across the park system to find this being the case. I started out actually as a volunteer when I was in graduate school, sort of exploring how I might be able to work my educational background together and have those applications in the real world. And I came to the recognition that perhaps the Park Service might be an option. And so I went to my local visitor center and talked to a ranger, and they said, well, a good place to start is to volunteer, and so that's what I did. So I did that for about 2 years and then started looking at seasonal employment for about 6 months and was able to get picked up at a national park in Massachusetts, and then that led me to come back to a different seasonal job back here at Jamestown, not too far from where we are today, and then I was able to pick up a permanent job with the Park Service out in Kansas. So it's a little bit of a ranger's tale there and back again before I could get transferred here to Fort Monroe as a permanent ranger.
Well, that's a good story too. Well, we'll keep with you for a few minutes. Tell us about this place. What makes this place special? Why is it here?
Fort Monroe is really an amazing place for its cross sections of history and connections. It has almost everything you'd want. It's got natural history, cultural history, military history, women's history. You name sort of the discipline, focus, and interest, there's probably something here to be said from the Native American stories when they were the only people present here on Old Point Comfort, this landmass that we call today Fort Monroe, utilizing the resources and areas. The first European arrival in 1607 land here and spend some time before their permanent settlement was built around the corner up at Jamestown. And then you start looking at other arrivals of others, including the 1619 arrival of the first 20 and odd enslaved Africans that arrived right here at Old Point Comfort. So it is that arrival that is a key instance where you have three different peoples and three different cultures coming together in the new world, as it were, and those creations of the interminglings of society, viewpoints, what people do and see and what they know starts that melting pot that leads to today of the United States that has representatives from all over the globe and societies and faiths and beliefs. It wasn't perhaps the altruistic way that they were envisioning it at the time, but it is still true. and then you move forward to the ideas of national defense and fortifications comes up to what you're seeing with the outflow of the War of 1812 and the establishment of an entire system of fortifications, this being the largest of that third system fortifications and the largest fortification ever constructed in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, there are a lot of buildings on this
Absolutely.
property and a lot of structures. What are your favorites?
You know, favorites is a hard question for me to answer because I find something in so many places, and it really depends on which stories that you might like to call attention to. The Old Point Comfort Lighthouse is the oldest continuously active lighthouse on the Chesapeake Bay, but it is also viewed as a beacon of freedom for arriving freedom seekers looking to find their own personal freedom here during the time of the American Civil War. And it was, in fact, had at least two men that had been enslaved people that were the head lightkeeper of that lighthouse for almost 40 years. So there's a lot of connections that can really be drawn on about how you can utilize the stories relative to that space. And that's really one of the moving ones. But also just behind us here at quarters number 1, which was the first building constructed, was the base headquarters and the house for the commander of Fort Monroe and what became the Department of Virginia. And it is there where we have amazing visitors. King of Hawaii was there, the Marquis de Lafayette, President Lincoln had stayed here, but it's also where that contraband decision from 1861 takes place. That is the beginning of the end of enslavement here in the United States, takes place in this structure. So when you put these stories together of freedom and seeking freedom and protection of this young country and the ideas that it espouses, there's so many choices and options that really exist.
Well, as kids are watching this right now, they see this beautiful tree behind us. Can you tell us a little bit
Absolutely.
about that?
This is a witness tree that we have. It's the Algernon oak, named in honor of the first fortification that was constructed here in 1609, Fort Algernon. And it is a witness tree that we believe, by scientific evidence of neighboring trees, is approximately 500 years old. And with that age, it means that when only the Native Americans were here, this tree was born. And so it has seen everything since before European colonialization and the arrival of the enslaved Africans, and everything up until the last active serving Army personnel left the fort in 2011, and then the beginning of the second century of stewardship with the National Park Service now. It has witnessed everything here that has taken place over that time. And it is an impressive example of a southern live oak with its breadth and its height. It is a champion tree of the Commonwealth of Virginia, but it is also interestingly related to the Emancipation Oak, which is on Hampton University's campus just over in this direction, which is reportedly where the first public reading of the Emancipation was given in Hampton Roads, and where some of those freedom seekers that become contraband, that find their way towards freedom here at Freedom's Fortress, begin their own new life with the education that is being provided by the American Missionary Association. That is the start of Hampton University's legacy and existence. So those connections, they're genetically related, helps to show how we can have context and connection outside of just where we are right here at Old Point Comfort.
Well, when we visit national parks, we know that the rangers have to interpret the history of the park. That's a lot of history for you to interpret. That's 200 plus years. So let me talk to Brittany for a minute. Brittany, in your job in making connections with students and other organizations, partnerships, what are the stories that you want students to really know about from this place?
Well, I'm most interested in that sort of cultural diversity that adds to the sort of society that comes out of these kind of origin stories, especially here in Hampton. You know, Hampton is like the oldest English-speaking community in the United States, or what would become the United States. And for the National Park Service Chesapeake office, we really invest in places that help people learn about the diverse history, the diverse stories that, you know, help us all connect to this special place. So we have out just a couple steps away the Chesapeake Bay, and you can stand there and imagine the various groups of people who all have stood on this land and thought about how we can build a new nation together. And yeah, just as Ranger Aaron was saying, lots of very ingenious, very creative, very innovative people who are thinking about what the future is going to look like on this land. Even folks who were originally here, who had to then, you know, as Native American, the different Native American groups had to really adjust to the arrivals of these new groups of people. So yeah, we talk a lot at NPS Chesapeake about these different groups of people: Native Americans, African Americans, the European Americans and their descendants, and the various groups that are still adding to that cultural diversity here in the States, and especially in our Chesapeake Bay Watershed. There's in fact about 18 million people in our watershed, so huge chunk of land and a huge society of people who are all connected to our same waterway.
We noticed that there were students here on site today, which is a very exciting thing to see students back in these places.
Yes.
What were they learning today, and who were they working with?
Yeah, so we have a great partnership, again, with the National Park Foundation. Many thanks to them for supporting us. We are working in collaboration with Hampton City Public Schools. Every 4th and 5th grader in Hampton City Schools, it's about 2,600 students or so, are learning about the rich heritage of Fort Monroe, the arrival of Africans, and the sort of creative and innovative skills that they brought with them from their home country, likely in the what is now Angola in Africa, to here in Virginia. And they're also learning about the Chesapeake as well. So this is an environmental science sort of education program where they're also getting to do investigations here on the land and near the water on the beach, and they'll also go out on a boat to learn about how they can also take care of our land and waterways, just as the Native Americans, the Africans, and the Europeans would have done when they arrived here.
It seems like a lot of partnerships come together to make these connections here, to tell this story, this 200 plus year story that you have to have in your toolbox, if you will. You were telling us earlier about some engineering things that were found here through maybe some archaeological digs. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's such a great connection, if you will, to these stories that are being told.
Absolutely, and that is at the heart of one facet of the investigations of what's going on here. If you look at this structure, as I mentioned, the largest fortification in the Western Hemisphere, it takes something to make that be true. And so science and engineering and mathematics all comes together to those areas, especially with the fact that geologically this is very sandy soil from its establishment. So that really came into what we were wanting to investigate during that project, is how were they constructing this fortification in the ways that they were doing it, giving the substrate or the ground that they're working on to make it stand and last for as long as it has. And so that's what they were doing with an archaeological project, and they were looking where two different walls came together and trying to see how the different arches that are at the heart of the successful building of this fortification, how were they coming together and what did that look like? Because they were two different arches from two different directions and they met. And so they wanted to investigate, what does that mean? So they're digging it down, because everywhere there's an arch above your head, there's an arch below your feet to transfer that weight. And so when they were digging down and taking a look, they were making a new discovery. They knew they came together, but the question was how. And when they did, you could actually see that the masons and the craftsmen were turning that arch out of bricks, so individual bricks piece by piece, and cutting and shaping and laying them in just such a pattern to get those two arches to come and turn, and then they knitted them together where they joined. And the masons that we had that were here, the master masons, said that that is just artwork and craftsmanship that is unlikely to be matched in most instances today. It's just not something you would probably see. That the skill needed to do that, and the time and money and cost and investment relative to that, is probably not something you're going to find, especially given that that was intended to then be covered in sand and then have a brick floor laid over it so that it would never be seen. And so to go through that level of care and craftsmanship to make it finished and dressed and look pretty as it did for something no one's ever going to see is really where the amazement factor came from. And then to look at who was building this fortification, and it is a combination of a lot of different peoples between Army personnel and Army personnel that had been convicted and were sort of serving a time of labor, but also contractors and tradesmen, as well as contracted enslaved Africans that were then tradesmen or general labor or whatever their skill levels were. That combination of workforce meant that there were people that were not free, that were skilled and excellent workers with a lot of knowledge and expertise that were laying their hands and their skills to work to construct this fortification that goes on many years later to be known as Freedom's Fortress, where the beginning of the end of slavery takes place. And it's that ingenuity and expertise when you put in the other layers of the story together is almost unprecedented.
What a beautiful visual of what you guys are trying to tell me today about the stories and the connections. Brittany, you said earlier that the ingenuity of the peoples that were here, the skills they had were used to better off the life of people here, right? And the stories, is there any particular story of someone that you can think of that used that ingenuity?
Yeah, one great example is John Mallory Phillips. He was an oysterman, a businessman. In the late 1800s, he established an oyster business and was able to kind of build his fortune here in Hampton. But he's one of many African American figures and other folks here in the Hampton Roads area that made their fortunes and made their lives really on the waters. We have here the Chesapeake Bay, and it extends through all the way up to Cooperstown, New York, through different rivers and waterways. But of course, we have right here in Hampton the James River, right, where collecting oysters was a part of the lifestyle of people as far back as the Native Americans to today. Still, the industry is very much thriving, and you'll often see folks, shucking oysters. Also, there's the crabbing and the crabbing industry where you'll see crab pickers and folks like that just out and about here in this very iconic Chesapeake community.
Yeah. And this witness tree behind us,
Yes, ma'am,
has seen all this.
absolutely.
It's seen the ingenuity and the innovation of this place and seen how it's grown. So I think that's going to lead us to our STEM challenge. So we're going to encourage kids to think about this place, not just Fort Monroe, but the area around it, the watermen, the people that lived here, from the Native Americans on through. And we want you to think about the partnerships, the people, the cultural diversity of the people here, and how working together they built that foundation, if you will, of looking towards freedom. So we want you to think about how we as humans can use the skills and resources of our fellow humans to make a difference in the world. So I'm trying to tell this story, but I think I'm going to need the collective help of my two rangers here, which kind of tells the story, if you will, anyway. But what are you thinking about this? What could students do to help tell stories better?
I think the idea of stewardship is the base rock of what we're talking about here at Fort Monroe, but with our partners that all come together and trying to work with the public. It's the preservation, the protection, and interpretation of these historic places that is at the heart of the National Park Service, but also how we as a society have come together and what we value from our own past and protect it for future generations. So the question is, how can we work together from our own skill sets and perspectives to have that be the base of things, to learn where we've come from and to help us get where we want to go together.
That's giving me chills, and that was giving me chills, not just the wind out here, but what do you want to add to that, Brittany?
I would also say that I think I agree with Ranger Aaron. There's a collection of skills, values, and a potential future that we can look together to build. And we can see that having its origins in places like this site here in Fort Monroe.
Well, that's our challenge. We want you to figure out how to use all of our voices to tell a story, to preserve what's here, and to tell the story for years to come. And guess what, kids? That was your advice also. That was the advice that they were going to give you in just a moment, and they've already given it to you. To get to know each other, to get to appreciate each other's skills, to get to just be, like we say all the time, being good humans, because we know that when your passion intersects your purpose, then you're on the right track. I want to thank you guys so much for having us out here today. It is a beautiful day, but a beautiful story of people and their perseverance and their persistence, and how we are moving forward in this world to be better than we were. And I think that's what we have to always remember, that together we are better. So thanks for joining us today at Fort Monroe National Monument in Hampton, Virginia, as part of the National Parks Expedition Challenge. On behalf of Dr. Drizzle, Ranger Brittany, and Ranger Aaron, we are out of here. Bye, guys.